Welcome to Reporting the World. I'm John Dancy, Director of International Media Studies at Brigham Young University. It has now been 30 years since the end of the Vietnam War, more than 10 years since Desert Storm. But the echoes of the battle between the military and the media still reverberate in the Pentagon, in newsrooms, and in classrooms where the media are studied. The questions are eternal ones in a democracy. How much access must the press have to soldiers and the fighting to properly inform the public in wartime? How much control should the military have over that access? Is there any common ground? To discuss this enduring problem, we've brought together Barry Zorthian, formerly the chief spokesman for the U.S. in Vietnam during 4.5 tumultuous years of the war, and a former senior Foreign Service officer. David Burrington, former NBC News correspondent who spent 18 months covering the war in Vietnam and covered the Tet Offensive by North Vietnam in the old imperial capital of Hue. And James Fetig, retired Army colonel with a long history in military public affairs, including a stint as Chief of Public Affairs for the Army's Southern Command in Panama and Chief of Public Affairs for the National Security Council at the White House. He's the author of a probing report on the problems of the military and the media during Desert Storm. Our program is being taped before a live audience of students in the studios of KBYU on the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Barry Zorthian, let's begin with you. You were named chief spokesman in 1964 in Vietnam as the war in Vietnam began to ratchet up and criticism of that war went on. What were you supposed to do?
Well, the relations between the media and the mission, let me pause a moment and point out one real distinction between the Vietnam War and the Gulf and other military operations, and that is that civilians were much more involved in the overall effort in Vietnam, as well as in the area of media relations. And I was a civilian when I was appointed to the position of overall responsibility for this. The mission was simply to deal with the press, to enable them to cover the war, to obtain a balanced, accurate coverage of the war, to make sure that the reporting back to the American people truly reflected what was going on.
And talk about the necessity for that. Why was that necessary at this point? Things were pretty bad, right?
Things were fairly bad. The government was disrupted. We were going through revolving door governments. The image that was emerging was of a Vietnamese government that couldn't hold itself in place, a Vietnamese military that was falling apart, and a very serious setback to American interests and the American effort there.
And what were your guidelines for dealing with the press, and who set those guidelines?
Guidelines were set by the National Security Council in a special directive. The key words in the guidelines were maximum candor with minimum security. My instructions was to get out the full story of the war, holding security considerations to the absolute minimum possible.
Why was it necessary to have a single spokesman at this point?
Remember, this was a period of the so-called insurgency, not of a conventional war. The mainline American units didn't start coming in until the early 1965. The effort in the field was a combined effort. We had provincial representatives who were military. We had provincial representatives who were helping with the AID programs. We had we had representatives in the various ministries to try to coordinate that war. And it was felt that one consistent and, shall I say, organized channel of communication of information about the war would be the most effective way of getting the word out.
Well, this all sounds very bureaucratic and cold-blooded and whatever, but in fact, in Washington, they were going nuts about the way the war was being covered, right?
Very much so. Very much so. They had gone through a couple of years of very, very adversarial at best, hostile at worst reporting of the war. It was very fragmented. The military had one channel, the civilians had another channel. What was emerging in Washington, what was emerging in the U.S. media and was affecting Washington was a very confusing picture.
And did these guidelines come from President Johnson himself, do you think?
Well, he signed off on them, and I'm sure, knowing the President Johnson's method of operation, I'm sure he read them thoroughly and even probably edited them. Yes, they were a directive to the ambassador of the United States in Vietnam, to the commander of U.S. military forces in Vietnam.
And David, you were on the other side in this whole controversy. You were a member of the press at this time. When did you go out to Vietnam?
I arrived in Vietnam in early 1966, stayed for a year and a half, and then went back for the Tet Offensive in early '68.
And when you got there, describe the mood between the press and the military and the press.
Well, from what I could see and see now, the mood, it was a good mood. The journalists, the correspondents felt they were getting a straight story from the military. We were given enormous access to the battlefield, and the military, not always totally candid, but you could usually find out from a source what was really going on in Vietnam. The problem was with, of course, the Vietnamese government and the Vietnamese troops, which were not very reliable, which caused really the buildup that came when Johnson finally decided to do a massive buildup and run this war, I think, his way. And I came in about 6 months after that began. The feeling was that this war was justified by what was conventional wisdom at the time, the domino theory. If Southeast Asia went, then the rest of the undeveloped world was at threat, and we had to stop communism there. So I would say there was mutual trust at that time between the press and the military. The problems came from Washington, from the political side of this, who felt that the truth was not really what they wanted to hear, and that is, once we got further into '66 and '67, things were just not going well. And no one lied to us about that in Vietnam, but that's not the story that they wanted to hear in Washington.
And did the mood change during the time that you were there?
Well, the mood changed as it became more and more clear that the area under control of friendly forces was diminishing. You could no longer drive places that you could drive a few months or 6 months before. There was the battlefield count was rising. More Americans were getting killed, and less seemed to be being accomplished. It seemed to be pretty much a stalemate or losing ground. So the mood changed from one of optimism that American troops could do anything to one of questioning and wondering, what was going wrong here.
So you had a situation where you were seeing the situation going downhill, and back in Washington, the government was telling people things were fine.
They didn't want to hear that it was going downhill, but the fact is things were going downhill.
The tension that existed between the military and the media at that time, how did that affect your reporting? Could you get accurate information?
You could always get accurate information from sources. That doesn't mean that every commander, every officer was being totally candid, in that his promotion might well depend on giving you a very optimistic view of something that wasn't all that encouraging. But you could always find out what was really going on, and you, as I said, you had tremendous access to the battlefield. You could see for yourself when you were lucky enough to be, or unlucky enough to be, in the middle of a major firefight, what was going on. What was really going on, it was that troops would move out from their centralized barracks into the field. There would be a lot of fighting, and then they'd move back, and the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese would take back the land that they had temporarily given up. So there didn't seem to be any progress, was over and over the impression that you got.
You have to remember that this, again, was a unique war in many ways. There was no single front line that moved up or down. There were battles in many parts of the country. Very often, as David has suggested, battle would take place and the troops on both sides would withdraw. You could have 30 engagements a day. Correspondents were able to cover 1, 2, 5, 10 of them, but the other 20 were not covered by anyway. And the picture that emerged, very often coverage by correspondents, was on the basis of what they had personally seen. The picture the government was transmitting to Washington was a picture of the overall situation, of all 30 engagements taken into account.
So,
and those two pictures were quite different at times.
So is it possible there was truth on both sides?
Yes, it is certainly possible. I've always said Vietnam was a series of grays, not a black and white.
Yeah. Jim Fetig, in Desert Storm, which you've studied extensively, the military controlled the press by controlling access to the front, whereas in Vietnam, reporters were pretty much free to go wherever they could get a ride or wherever they could get to. Was that a better way than in Vietnam? That is controlling access to the front?
I don't know what you mean by better. It depends, I think, on what the government's objective was. There were a number of reasons that was done. Operational security was one of them. You were dealing with heavily mechanized armies, with organized air forces, and in the beginning, the U.S.'s intelligence estimate of the Iraqi capabilities was flawed. It was wrong, but we had no way of knowing that it was wrong. Our assumption was they were much more capable than they were. What we were trying to do more by limiting access was cover up our weaknesses until we had the time to build the strength required to mount an adequate defense.
Talk more about that, please.
And the thought was that what we had to do was let the American people know what was happening there, what their troops were doing, but it was not thought that you could make known to the Iraqis through news reporting what our vulnerabilities were, and that was part of what we were trying to avoid.
Okay, that raises an interesting question in my mind. Talk a little bit about the mindset of the military in a war that is going to be covered by the media. What's the military's first thought in a situation like that?
Well, the military's first thought is something called operational security. That's denying the enemy any information which might be useful to the conduct of the enemy's battle plan. Surprise is almost everything. That has to be then balanced, of course, with the fact that the U.S. military is part of a democratic enterprise, and the public do have a right to know, and you function only at the will of the public. And so you have to serve two masters. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Barry, in Vietnam, there was no censorship, and pretty much reporters were free to go wherever they wanted to go. In retrospect, was that a good idea?
I think in principle it was a good idea because of the nature of the war. And perhaps more realistically, it was a good idea because the alternative wasn't possible. We did not control the movement of correspondents. This was a sovereign country, Vietnam. They could move anywhere they wanted on their own. We did not control their communication. A number of the agencies had their own communications direct to the United States or elsewhere. And we didn't control their logistics. They lived wherever they wanted to. They ate as they wanted to. They were not in uniform as they were in World War II. So we couldn't have imposed censorship even if we had wanted to. And I think in principle, as I say, we shouldn't have wanted to. Vietnam government was the sovereign government. If censorship had been imposed, Vietnamese would have had to impose it. And the picture of Vietnamese handling the output, the print and video output of 300 to 600 correspondents is just an impossible situation.
Well, what was the difference between Vietnam and Desert Storm then? Were you more successful at controlling the military simply because you're out in the middle of the desert?
Well, time and distance had a huge factor. It started with the fact that the Saudi Arabian government was very uncomfortable having large numbers of Western correspondents running about in their country. And they limited the number of visas that would allow correspondents to enter, so that number probably never exceeded 1,200. The records for that were not kept very well, and so it's not possible to have an exact number. The rest of it was determined mostly by the time and distance factor. The troops were really far out into the desert. It was very difficult for anybody to get to them. If you were moving about as a civilian, you were suspect, and since there was absolutely nothing else out there and no reason for anyone unconnected with the operations to be there, you would have risked arrest and being sent back. And so the military organized tours, pools, if you will, to bring correspondents to where the troops were. Unfortunately, the thirst for news exceeded the supply of news in those days. There wasn't a lot going on. There were troops arriving and troops moving into the field, and that's about it. The correspondents were looking for much more than that. Unfortunately, it wasn't there.
John, you asked about the mindset of the military towards the media, and you noted that in Vietnam, the media were able to go where they wanted, cover what they want without censorship. The result, the product of all that, I think you could properly describe as not disciplined, uncontrolled, not getting into the substantive aspects of it, but in a way, coverage of Vietnam was messy. I think the military, putting even aside those who were extremists and to say, quote, the press lost the war in Vietnam, which is not justified. But the military said we do not want in the Gulf this kind of undisciplined, uncontrolled coverage. So that they establish rules, escorts, pool approach, pre-transmission censorship, review of copy, in order to get a more cohesive, a more disciplined, a more controlled coverage. Not necessarily a false one, but one that did not have these drawbacks of what came out of Vietnam.
Did Vietnam, the coverage of Vietnam, poison the well for reporters who went to Saudi Arabia?
Well, remember the last American combat troops left in '72. 90, 91, 18 years. I think there was a layer of the military, if you will, who by then had gotten up to perhaps colonel rank, one-star general rank, who may have had some of the postmortem feelings about Vietnam, about the media in Vietnam. The younger field grade officers, captains, sergeants, and so on, I think probably were not as affected. Jim would know a lot better about that than I would.
The problem is you deal with stereotypes and conventional wisdom that develops. And what happened at the end of Vietnam, there was this myth within the military services that the media had lost the war in Vietnam. They certainly weren't considered friendly, and in many cases inside military culture, they were considered the enemy. When the forces deployed to Saudi Arabia, the press, equally guilty of stereotyping the military as far as they were concerned, and the pool reporting clearly shows that, they were probing for the ghosts of Vietnam. So you had the military defending against the ghosts of Vietnam and the media probing for this. And so you were looking for drug-addled, ill-led, indisciplined troops who were perfectly willing and able of criticizing civilian leadership in Washington. And that's how the coverage began. And the military went into a defensive crouch because inside military culture they were not friendly. They were the enemy.
But isn't there a basic conflict here in that the military wants to look good?
Oh, sure.
And
absolutely.
If they can't control the news, they maybe won't always look good. So there's a tremendous incentive for the military to make sure that what goes out makes them look good. And in Vietnam, it wasn't possible, and the military, on the quiet at least, would admit this, that you can't look good when you're losing ground.
Well, commanders in the Gulf were acutely aware of the power of television, and they knew that the picture presented at home was critical to maintaining public support for the troops in the field. And they did everything they could to make sure that picture was coherent and disciplined, as Barry said.
And favorable.
Yes.
Now, in the report that you wrote about the military, particularly the Army's handling of the press in Desert Storm, you point to one specific story by one New York Times reporter who went out, spent some time out in the field with some troops, wrote a report that I would characterize as mildly critical. The patrol got lost coming back to base for a short time. A lower grade soldier there criticized President Bush and did it in front of the reporter. The soldier later said that he didn't say what the reporter said, but you lay all this to this one story.
Well, what happened was that you had this tension that developed between the military and the media, based fundamentally in Vietnam, and you had the media looking for troops who would criticize the political leadership in Washington, and it finally happened. And a soldier criticized President Bush. It appeared in the New York Times on page 18, which is not a very prominent page. But the White House reacted sharply in Washington. How could this happen? Find out what this is about. The military in the field knew that's what the media was up to in their heart of hearts, and they shut the door.
They're out to get us again.
They're out to get us again, and the door got shut, and it was over on the 18th of October.
Right, and that carried on through
through April when the conflict was over.
Right.
Remember that the attitude of the military towards the media had been intensified by two events that took place between Vietnam and the Gulf. And that was the landing of American troops in Panama and the landing of American troops in Grenada, both of which, in media terms, were completely a mess.
A disaster, I think.
A disaster, wouldn't it? And so that strengthened any of these reservations. I mean,
for the benefit of our students here in the studio and for the audience, in Panama, the press was taken in as a pool and basically kept far away from the action. And in Grenada, they weren't taken in until several days after the invasion had taken place, and everything was pretty well over at that time. Barry, just describe for us kind of what you did as chief spokesman in Vietnam on a day-to-day basis. How close were your contacts with Washington? Were you on the phone with them daily, for example, or many times a day?
They were on the phone with me. More usual. No, there was constant communication up to and including the President of the United States, not to me particularly, but to Ambassadors Bunker and Taylor and to General Westmoreland. The day was a busy one and not a short one, certainly. But one of the things we did was commit ourselves to a briefing on the day's activities every day at a set time. And we started those briefings. After the first week, they were joint briefings, civil and military, at 5 o'clock in a room that we were able to develop into an auditorium and so on. That became the famous or infamous 5 o'clock follies. I don't take much offense at the name. I do deny the implications of it. But other than that briefing, for which the military went through their whole reporting procedure from the field and provided whatever information there was at hand, all through the day, our media relations people were on a telephone or directly in touch with correspondents, helping them get aboard planes to get out to the field, setting up appointments on special fields they wanted, setting up whatever other information was available.
And David, as a reporter in Vietnam, tell me about your day-to-day activities. How did you get on an airplane or a chopper to go somewhere, for example? How did you report back? How did you get your video back to the United States?
Well, there was a basic area where you would go, Tan Son Nhut Airport, Saigon Airport, where the military planes would be, were basically shuttles that would take troops mainly out to the main areas of the country where our presence was, but correspondents could get on too. And so those planes would take you to Da Nang, which is a main center that you'd head out to the battlefield from. And so if you were going into the field, you'd go to Saigon Airport, you'd get on a plane, you'd end up in Da Nang, you'd go to the Da Nang Press Center, you'd spend some time there getting briefed on what was going on in that area, and then you'd arrange to go out with Marines wherever you thought might be a promising area. Or you might go to Hue. When I first arrived there, trucks were still, could drive to Hue, but only civilian trucks, and that soon ended. They had a train that they would try to send to Hue about once every 6 months or so just to prove that they could do it, but the train didn't carry anything. There was always this effort to indicate the way was open. So,
and how dangerous was that, doing it the way you were doing it?
It depends. I'd say about once a month, you'd say you were in a firefight and you say, "What am I doing here? I don't have to be here." So it wasn't dangerous all the time. At times it was intensely dangerous, mm-hmm. But that's when you got the story that the network wanted, and that's a good bang story with lots of shooting going on. So you were under pressure to do that kind of story.
Were there stories that got on the air simply because they had good bang, as you say, and not because they were particularly important?
I would say most of the firefights were not particularly important. You would try to use them as a stepping stone to explain what the war was all about, but that was the basis of the pictures that people saw.
On a sort of day-to-day basis, what were your relations with the military and the press officers?
Well, my relations were good. I thought for the most part we were getting a straight story. The story behind the story was harder to get, but if you had contacts, you could usually get some background into what was really going on. And that was the real problem. As time went on, the background reports were not very optimistic. And there were certain fiascos, like I don't know if you remember, Barry, when they decided they were going to start at the DMZ and clear a path all the way across the country so no one could infiltrate. And there were bulldozers. I think that lasted a couple of months when they realized, first of all, most of the North Vietnamese coming out went through Cambodia, didn't even come that way. And it was impossible to clear this line. So it just sort of fizzled out.
That was the McNamara line. Right. We were going to seed the whole area with sensors so that anything that moved or came across there would be identified quickly. But as David said, the North Vietnamese didn't cooperate. They went down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
But that's sort of
instead.
that is sort of indicative and or typical of the sort of thinking that took place in Vietnam. It was just sometimes it bordered on the.
It was
bizarre.
not a conventional war.
Well, and to the military's credit, that led the entire U.S. Armed Forces to rethink its approach to military strategy, and what that produced was the invasion of Panama, which from a purely military standpoint was probably one of the finest military operations in the history of the world. And Desert Storm, which was a brilliant strategic success up to the point it was stopped.
Was there ever a moment, Jim, when you think the press coverage in Vietnam could have been turned around, turned to the U.S. advantage?
From what I know of it and what I've studied, and the part, I was a very junior officer at that period of time, I don't think so, because reality, what you had as stated political objectives and the reality on the ground never matched. And every time there's a mismatch like that, you have no credibility. You lose your credibility. And without credibility, you can't turn the coverage. I think that up until the very end, the coverage was very fair. As David said, you know, the military wants to look good, and at the end of Vietnam, a lot of the reports were about fragging or the troops killing their commanders and drug abuse and those kinds of things, racial problems and other things that were true. There was nothing that was inaccurate, but it certainly embarrassed the military as an institution. And from that, the way the military internalized that and the way it became enculturated was, well, we're trying to look good, but they're trying to make us look bad. Mm-hmm. And so you had this classic conflict that developed.
I often make the point, John, that there was not a Vietnam War. There were a series of wars. The French period, the Diem period, the period that I was there, basically the buildup of American troops. Then the drawdown of American troops, and the period after '69, where draftees from the U.S., the marijuana culture hit the troops there. The Army was really demoralized in a great sense. All these had different implications, and different implications for media-military relations.
How did you personally, Barry, regard the reporters who were writing all of these critical stories about Vietnam? David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, Malcolm Brown, Peter Arnett. How did you regard them, and how did you deal with them?
I tried to communicate with them, and they with me. Our relations on a personal basis were excellent. We'd argue over some of their stories. Sometimes they'd concede the point I would have. Very often they did not. You have to bear in mind that there is no such thing as the media. There are all kinds of media representatives with all kinds of viewpoints. When we talk about the media in Vietnam, generally we're trying to talk about the national media, the networks, the major newspapers, the news magazines, the wire services. But even there were considerable differences. And a lot of the correspondents in Vietnam were from individual newspapers, from individual radio operations, came out for a very brief time, went back with certain concepts and sometimes quite different concepts.
Did you, when somebody wrote a critical report about Vietnam, did you then try to freeze them out or try to win them over?
No. You would never make any points trying to freeze out a legitimate reporter. If a reporter is completely irresponsible, violating security, violating tactical military information, obviously you would freeze him up. But none of the principal reporters in Vietnam fell in that category. No, communication would continue. You'd try to provide the background that you thought was essential to it. You'd try to give your perception of what things were happening, put your spin on, if that's the current word. But no, communication had to continue, unless there was such a gross violation of something that it merited cutting off a reporter.
Do you agree with that, David?
I think so. I thought our treatment was very fair in Vietnam. But I'd like to ask you, looking, if you could have seen back then what's happened, that we now have relations with Vietnam, that the domino theory is a joke, could you have dreamed that we would be in the situation we are today?
No, I don't think so. But that was 30 years ago. Let's remember, things do change. I wouldn't take a bet today that we won't be back in Cam Ranh Bay as an official U.S. base one day, the way things go.
Did you favor some reporters over others?
I guess inevitably you get to know some reporters better than others, particularly ones there a longer time, and you get to trust them. When I say trust some reporters better than others, that doesn't mean they're going to write what you would like, but at least that they're people of their word and that they will seek to give you balance. Even if they're writing a critical piece, they'll give some exposure to an opposing viewpoint, to your viewpoint, if you will. In that sense, I guess, yes, probably tried to favor some. Much more in a way of favoring reporters would be to get them set up for interviews with people they want to see. The ambassador, general, someone out in the field, and so on. Where General Westmoreland would call and say, so-and-so wants an interview, shall I do it? And you might say yes, or you might say no, that man isn't reliable. He won't keep his word.
So some reporters benefited by writing balanced stories.
Balanced stories, if you will, a fair story, even if it was critical.
Bill Prochnow, former Washington Post reporter, wrote a book called Once Upon a Distant War.
Very good book. I commend it to anyone to read.
About the reporters in Vietnam, and he quotes you in the book as saying that you received Joseph Alsop, the conservative columnist, like a visiting head of state.
Well, those were some special cases. Joe Alsop didn't deign to communicate with me. He would communicate only with the ambassador. He'd send a cable out saying, Mr. Ambassador, I'll be in Saigon at such and such a date and would appreciate staying at your residence.
Have you got a spare room?
At which point the ambassador would call me and say, get him off my back, get a car out there, pick him up, and have him stay with you. But those were very limited cases.
Yeah.
And Joe was a character unto himself, so that.
Some reporters obviously went to Vietnam because it was the big story and because they wanted to be there at that time. Did you find that there were people there who were only there for the glory? Let me ask David. Maybe you had a different experience of this.
Absolutely. I would say not very many, but sure, there were some there that would try to make themselves part of the story, especially in television, with dramatic on-camera gaspings, et cetera. And these guys were easy to spot, and I think most people had a certain amount of contempt for that. I don't think it was that widespread, but sure, there were people like that.
Well, that's always the case. You saw that in the Gulf War. Arthur Kent, the Stud Scud, or Stud Scud, I can't say it. Anyway, when the Scuds were incoming, and everybody feared that these warheads might be armed with lethal poison gas. There was Arthur with his live on camera, standing out on the terrace, reporting the explosions and so on and so forth, while all of his
gas mask.
With his gas mask on, while all of his colleagues were huddled in the basement.
He did a lot for leather jackets, though.
Yes, he did.
You know, there are all kinds of strange aspects of Vietnam. In the middle of that war, we were still getting tourists coming in.
Tourists?
Coming up on French passenger ships up the Saigon River. They'd let down the gangplank, come ashore with their dark glasses and cameras and say, "Where's the war? We want to go cover it. We want to go watch it." Then you'd have what I call non-journalists, because one of the perks of journalists, accredited journalists, was a PX card.
Right.
And many people would come down there, adventurers of one type or another, who'd gone to their hometown editor, whom they might know personally, and say, "Give me a little letter accrediting me." Came out to us to be a viewer there, to help spend a week or two in the war zone, have access to the PX, not do any coverage at all. There were more of those than you'd like to think of. Then we had 3-day wonders. Everyone wanted to get their ticket punched. I've been in Vietnam, I've covered it. They'd send a telegram out, "I'm coming out, please set up interviews with the ambassador, the commander, the field, get me out to the field, I want to talk to some Vietnamese, and I'm leaving 3 days later." And this is like covering Vietnam out of a moving train as you go by, you know, that's the way. And they would come by the dozen so that they could go home and the next cocktail party say, "I was just out in Vietnam and here's the real story."
What kind of an effect, if any, did that have on the commanders and the military in the
Drive
field?
them crazy. No, it was a burden to the commander in the field. He'd have to pay some attention to it. If he didn't, he might end up with a very nasty, unjustified story. The commanders did not mind legitimate correspondents who were doing a job and facing up to the trials of Vietnam. But the 3-day wonders and so on were a burden.
David, by 1966, when you went out to Vietnam, the anti-war movement in the country was rising. The whole hippie generation had come about, the drug culture was growing, and so forth. Did you feel under pressure to write the story down rather than up, that is, negatively rather than positively?
I didn't, because, one, I don't think that culture had that much power as it had a few years later. The mood in Vietnam was, as I referred before, the domino theory. We had a good reason to be there. Our army was keeping the free world from being threatened even more. And I think everyone pretty much bought that scenario. And so the peace movement had no effect on my reporting. One, it was quite a ways away and didn't affect me, didn't affect our bosses in New York. I think later on is when that influence became to be felt a lot more than in '66, '67.
Were you ever told by your editors that a story was too positive?
No, that never happened.
That did happen in the Gulf. There was a woman who was the assistant Washington bureau chief at AP who was extremely skeptical of the military. She was a Vietnam era person, and she absolutely talked to reporters and talked some of their stories into much more negative slants than they might have otherwise taken.
In other words, she was back in Washington directing the coverage from Washington or from the States.
Right.
Yeah.
And here's where producers and editors have responsibilities that I don't think they always fulfill. And that is they are editors and producers and are supposed to be judges, editorial judges of the product of their reporters. One of the series of very damaging stories in Vietnam was about some air operations done by one of the Shell brothers who was a pacifist. Now, a man has a perfect right to be a pacifist. But when he writes a story about combat, and it's all completely negative and critical, I think his editor has the responsibility of putting in a footnote or at the head, the writer of this story is a confirmed pacifist, and his coverage comes from that viewpoint. Otherwise, the reader doesn't know this. He doesn't know what vantage point that reporter is providing.
John, I think probably more of an influence than the peace movement on negative stories would be what was happening to the people of Vietnam. And very few people were paying any attention to that. They were being bombed, they were being persecuted by both sides, depending on who was in power where they happened to be living. And they had no control over their lives whatsoever. They couldn't, the voting was a farce there. I mean, they were the objects of all of this fighting. It was very depressing to go in and see a village that had been virtually wiped out by either side, by our side, because there were suspected Viet Cong living there, and see all of the villagers huddling there, having no comprehension of what was going on at all. And those were negative stories, but those were true stories because these people were being victimized by both sides.
Did those stories get reported?
Yeah, some did.
And that led to...
What do you think about that?
Very limited numbers. If there's any true unfairness in the coverage of Vietnam, it was about the Vietnamese side, the Vietnamese people. The government had many flaws, including corruption and then incompetence and so on. But the people themselves, those Vietnamese soldiers who were being killed, what was happening in the hamlets on, got very little honest, balanced coverage.
Partly because you couldn't get there.
Well, that was probably.
I think, though, late in the war, particularly when the B-52s were bombing Hanoi, after Jane Fonda had been to Vietnam, the coverage shifted, and you had a lot more reporting of some of these atrocities, which were against the laws of wars and the doctrine of the United States, at least our democratic principles. And part of the strategy of the anti-war movement came to vilify the soldiers themselves. And I know as a young man then, unmarried, it was hard to get a date because girls wouldn't date guys who were wearing uniforms. Merchants in stores didn't want to take your check. And you had short hair and everybody else had long hair. It was a very hard time to be a soldier in society. It actually worked. That then embittered many people who remained in uniform, and you saw that then reassert itself in Desert Storm.
Well, we haven't gone into Tet very much, but Tet obviously was a seminal event. But even after Tet,
let's stop for the benefit of our students who were unborn at the time Tet took place, and explain what happened at Tet. Okay.
Tet Offensive took place late January, early February of 1968. This was at a time when the impression was growing in the United States, through some efforts by the government, speech by General Westmoreland and by Ambassador Bunker, that considerable progress was being made in Vietnam. Tet is the traditional Asian holiday, celebrated very, very completely and widely in Vietnam, and even in times of conflict. There's supposed to be a ceasefire, a armistice, if you will, for 1 or 2 days. Families get together. It's our Christmas, our New Year's, our Thanksgiving all rolled into one. On Tet of 1968, the VC, through obvious months of planning and so on, launched 38, I believe the number was 38, different attacks in different cities and provinces in Vietnam. A great, great shock, suddenly hitting the front pages of every newspaper in the United States, every television station, news show, and so on. And this event, which was anticipated to some extent by the military command in Vietnam, but certainly wasn't anticipated by the public, came as a great shock and was an enormous, not military, but a psychological victory for the VC, for the North Vietnamese. There are many aspects of it you can go into. Militarily, it was ultimately a defeat for the Northerners. As I say, psychologically, it had an impact. A lot of the fighting took place right in the area where many of the correspondents lived. So their initial stories were of them being in the middle of firing, of personal combat. And that had quite an effect. CBS did a lot of footage, ran raw footage of fighting around the embassy in the middle of Saigon, and that had an impact. But even after Tet, surveys showed the majority of American people were still supportive of the effort there. Now, as body bags came home, as more and more American casualties took place, Life magazine did a very notable edition in which they ran a picture of every American who was killed over a 1-week period in Vietnam, and it covered, what, 3 pages, 2 pages, whatever it was. Had an enormous effect. Then public support began to fall off until by 69, 70, we went into this whole series of demonstrations in the U.S., the difficulties around the Pentagon.
David, you were there and you covered Tet. I remember some notable footage of you with the troops in a firefight during Tet. Were you aware that this was a landmark in the war, that things were not going to be the same after this?
Only to the degree that it had never happened before, and it had to be a new chapter. Where it would lead, of course, nobody knew. I was sent to Hong Kong. Originally, no one said, would you go back to Vietnam? Which I would probably have said no. But I was sent to Hong Kong to help edit all the massive amounts of footage. Or no, Tokyo. It was coming in by satellite. Satellite connections had been established by then. And among the other footage we had exclusive was, remember Colonel Luan, the security chief? He executed a Viet Cong in the middle of a street in Saigon. He saw the whole thing, the blood spurting out of his head, and that was a graphic image that most people who saw it never forgot. So then they said, since you're so close, would you go on to Vietnam and cover the Tet Offensive? So I was encouraged to do that, and found a whole different situation. In Hue especially, the city of Hue had been taken over by the Viet Cong, and it was a slow and very bloody effort to take that back. Well, this was all new. It had never happened before, so there was no question it was a new equation. The fact, as Barry said, that it was a failure in terms of the number of troops that they lost, and tactically they didn't really gain much real territory finally. That escaped everybody. It was just overwhelming.
Okay, so we have the situation where the Tet Offensive takes place. The military thinks they've won, and the statistics clearly show that they've won. But back in the United States, they've lost the battle in the press. Did this change things in Vietnam for reporters?
Well, see, I left right after the Tet Offensive. I didn't stick around very long. But of course, the North Vietnamese started coming in great, massive amounts too, which meant that those figures they had of how many Viet Cong had been killed and all that became sort of meaningless because the reinforcements were arriving.
You said, did it change things? I guess the answer is no. The reporters in Vietnam, of which there were many more by now, continued their coverage of the war, but obviously with a great deal more skepticism about anything that was coming from the government than they had had before. It wasn't until August of 1968, 5 months after Tet, that the first comprehensive story saying Tet was really a military victory, written by Charlie Moore of the New York Times, a highly respected reporter, ran, and that was the first time that was surfaced. The focus was all on the negative impact of Tet.
I think the issue, though, wasn't necessarily military, it was political.
That's right.
Expectations had been set in Washington through a series of speeches that General Westmoreland gave and pronouncements from the State Department and White House that something like that could not happen. Victory was just around the corner, if you remember. When that happened, that was a political shock in Washington. It was a political shock to everybody because it was unexpected, and that was the problem.
You've got an interesting take, Jim, on General Westmoreland being out there pumping for the war. Was that a good idea?
That was a very bad idea. President Johnson wanted General Westmoreland to come back to Washington and had for some time to give some speeches in support of the war, to help build public opinion support for the war. I read the cable traffic, and Westmoreland was very clearly opposed to doing that, but ultimately relented. It was probably the worst mistake he made.
What's the issue here?
Politicians are responsible for the prosecution of war. They're responsible for selling the war to the public. Generals should not sell the war. Generals should fight the war. And generals are responsible for the amount of confidence the public should have in the political objectives, whether or not they're militarily achievable. But they're certainly not responsible and should not be selling the political objectives.
Let's bring this up more or less to modern times now.
Excuse me, John. Jim's absolutely right, but there were reasons for that. President Johnson was realistic enough to know that his credibility was virtually gone. And the only one who he felt had credibility with the American public was General Westmoreland. And so he used him, just as plainly as Jim has said, to come back and report on the war and say there was progress. The speech was very carefully written, and if you read it carefully, which obviously was not done, and it was interpreted as much more optimistic than it was, It said next year we'll see the beginning of the end of the war, and we can start withdrawing American troops in 2 years. Now, that wasn't a victory tomorrow morning, but that's the way it was interpreted.
In Desert Storm, General Schwarzkopf studiously avoided doing just that.
Well, he did, as well as the entire military establishment. They made a decision not to sell the war. They would support the president, and they would tell the public what their capabilities were, but they did not go out and consciously try to sell that war to the American public.
Has there been, as a result of Vietnam and of Desert Storm, has there been a public affairs doctrine written in the Army?
The military, the Army in particular, has taken a very hard look at what happened there, and they have tried to develop a set of rules, a doctrine for interacting with the press, but press relations are dependent on the personality of the commanders involved, and very often the commanders may have some problems, and therefore the doctrine is not used.
Okay, let's talk about that. You think, in your report, you said, I'm paraphrasing now, these are not your words, that the Army did a terrible job of dealing with the press in Desert Storm and the Marines did a great job. What's the difference?
What's the difference is the Marines opened themselves up to the press and the Army did not. The Army put itself at grave risk for loss of public confidence. Had there been some large reversal of fortune, an atrocity on the level of My Lai, the Army's credibility would have been at grave risk. Marines, on the other hand, opened their doors to the press. They welcomed the press. The myth has now developed that all of that press coverage was very positive. In fact, it was not. But what is remembered is what was positive of it. And the Marines became the heroes of the Gulf War, and nobody knows what the Army did.
We're all now 30-plus years older than we were during Vietnam. And as I was thinking about doing this discussion with you all, I wondered to what extent the sort of negative coverage, the confrontational attitude between the military and the media that took place in Vietnam took place because we were all so young. You had never had a war, a modern war, where the press was allowed to go out and cover anything they wanted to. And you'd never had a war in which the press was so willing to confront the power structure of the United States. Given all that, if we had another war like this with the same conditions, would the same things happen again? Barry?
I don't know, but I would add to your conditions what I would regard as a critically important one, and that is that the government, whether it was the military or the civilian side, the White House, or in that situation, Saigon, was not honest with the media and essentially, ultimately, with the public. And that unless it's ready to make sure that there's no gap between what it says and what's happening in the field, unless it's ready to be completely honest, subject always to appropriate security, that it will lose the confidence, certainly first of the media and ultimately of the public.
David, you were there. How much of the way you covered the war was a product of you being in your 20s, 30s at that time?
Well, it would be quite different today, believe me. I mean,
you'd be a lot more cautious, right?
Yeah, you bet. A lot of it was so willingness to go out and get shot at and get your story. But I think, I can't see that the military would ever allow again the amount of access we had in Vietnam. I don't think that'll ever happen because, of course, wars have changed too. But I can only see that there will be tighter restrictions on the press in any military action ahead. But as always, I think to get the story, you have to establish a degree of trust both ways between whoever you're dealing with, and then I think it's easier and maybe the only way to find out what's really going on.
Jim, would it happen the same way again?
Well, first of all, the military wouldn't prosecute the war the same way. We've learned a lot about warfare. Weapons have changed. We interact with our political masters much differently now than we did then. And I say we, being that I'm retired, but still part of that institution. Technology has changed. It's almost impossible to keep the press away. Anybody now with a small handheld phone can call home or call the network. can call anybody. People can post on the internet via a satellite cell phone, video and pictures. The world has changed.
Let me ask you all for a quick answer to this. How do we arrive at some sort of a ceasefire between the military and the media?
I think relationships now are much better than they were. They're far less adversarial. I think the two institutions understand each other much better, and they're much more willing to work together. It's not to say that, and there should be an adversarial relationship, but it's not as destructive as it once was.
David?
I think as long as you're getting the straight story and feel you are, that everything is, it's when you feel that they're trying to put a good face on something that doesn't deserve it, that's when the thing breaks down.
Barry?
Let me disagree with David for a moment when he says he doesn't think the military will ever permit the degree of access the media had in Vietnam. They may not want to, but I'm convinced that the military can never again have a controlled war, that it's going to be transparent, the technology has developed too far, the pervasiveness of the media is too great, and I think, how can the military and the media get together? The military accepting that concept and planning and developing in that direction.
Barry Zorthian, David Burrington, Jim Fetig, thank you all for being our guests today. You've added greatly to the knowledge of our students. As we've heard today, Vietnam was a generation ago, Desert Storm, a decade past, but the wounds they opened between the media and the military are still fresh. A new generation of soldiers and reporters has grown up indoctrinated in old ways of thinking about each other. Unless there are concerted efforts to change that, the next war the United States fights will see a renewal of the battle between the military and the media. For Brigham Young University and Reporting the World, I'm John Dancy. Thank you and good day.